In the late 1970s, Aerosmith was already a household name. Steven Tyler's raspy vocals, Joe Perry's sharp riffs, and their wild stage presence had made them one of the most dangerous and exciting rock bands around. When Van Halen came onto the scene, fresh-faced and hungry, they were seen as the new kids trying to climb the ladder. At first, Aerosmith didn't know what to make of them. The band looked young, too polished, and almost too energetic. Rumors spread quickly that Van Halen wanted to outshine Aerosmith at every chance. To Aerosmith, they seemed like little brothers who were trying way too hard to prove themselves. But under the surface, the clash wasn't just about music. It was about ego, status, and pride. Aerosmith didn't like the idea of another band stealing their spotlight. To them, Van Halen wasn't just competition. They were annoying intruders into a world Aerosmith had fought hard to dominate. What Aerosmith didn't realize at that moment was that Van Halen wasn't trying to copy them. They were bringing something new, something bold. It would take time, but Aerosmith would eventually see Van Halen for what they really were. The first time Aerosmith and Van Halen toured together, things got heated fast. Van Halen opened for Aerosmith, but their fiery performances often left audiences breathless before Aerosmith even hit the stage. Eddie Van Halen's guitar solos were unlike anything Steven Tyler and Joe Perry had ever seen before. The tapping technique, the speed, the showmanship. It felt like a revolution in real time. But instead of admiration, Aerosmith first felt irritation. To them, Van Halen was showing off, trying to steal the show that Aerosmith had worked years to build. Backstage, Aerosmith reportedly complained that Van Halen's set was too long, too loud, and too distracting. The younger band seemed to enjoy pushing the limits, while Aerosmith, despite their own chaotic image, saw it as a lack of respect. Audiences, however, loved both. Fans weren't comparing Aerosmith and Van Halen. They were just thrilled to see two powerhouse bands on the same bill. But for Aerosmith, the competition stung. They had built their empire with sweat and chaos, and here came Van Halen, making it look effortless. That sting would eventually turn into something else. But in those early days, annoyance ruled. Steven Tyler, never one to hide his emotions, was especially vocal about his feelings toward Van Halen. He often grumbled about their style, their energy, and their eagerness to impress. Tyler was Aerosmith's showman. His flamboyant scarves, wild screams, and non-stop antics were the band's trademark. Suddenly, David Lee Roth showed up with his own bag of tricks, high kicks, acrobatics, and over-the-top charisma. To Tyler, it felt like Van Halen was stepping directly on his toes. The rivalry wasn't personal at first, but Tyler's pride made it hard to watch another frontman grab attention so easily. He would tell people backstage that Van Halen was too much or trying too hard. For Aerosmith, it was almost like looking in a mirror of their younger selves, and that wasn't comfortable. But what Tyler didn't admit, at least publicly, was that Van Halen's energy sparked something. They were different, but they weren't fake. Van Halen had the same hunger Aerosmith once had, and despite the frustration, Tyler couldn't ignore the effect they had on crowds. Slowly, admiration was creeping in, even if it was buried under layers of annoyance. Behind the scenes, guitarists Joe Perry and Eddie Van Halen represented the true heart of the tension. Perry was blues-driven, raw, and gritty. His riffs came from a place of swagger and soul. Eddie, meanwhile, was a technical wizard. He played like no one before him, reinventing what the soul guitar could do. At first, Perry saw Eddie's style as unnecessary flash. To him, the tricks and finger tapping felt more like a circus act than real rock and roll, but audiences didn't see it that way. They were stunned, sometimes more by Eddie's guitar solos than anything else they saw that night. Perry, who had always been the guitar hero in Aerosmith, suddenly found himself compared to a newcomer. That didn't sit well. But with time, Perry began to see the brilliance. Eddie wasn't just showing off. He was changing the instrument. Guitarists everywhere were imitating his style, and it was clear Eddie was no passing fad. Joe Perry may not have loved it at first, but deep down, he respected it. The battle between raw blues and futuristic technique was less a rivalry and more a moment where two worlds of guitar collided. The backstage environment on those tours was often tense. Aerosmith carried themselves like veterans, loud and chaotic, but in control of their domain. Van Halen, on the other hand, arrived with youthful energy, often pulling pranks, cracking jokes, and keeping things lighthearted. To Aerosmith, this seemed disrespectful. They mistook the fun for arrogance. Stories floated around about Van Halen blasting music in their dressing room too loud or making too much noise when Aerosmith wanted quiet. Some nights, David Lee Roth's antics backstage rubbed Aerosmith the wrong way, especially when he bragged about their crowd reaction. Aerosmith saw it as immaturity, while Van Halen saw it as living the dream. But underneath the playful chaos, Van Halen actually looked up to Aerosmith. They admired their rawness and their ability to dominate a stage. It just didn't always show in their behavior. The clash wasn't really about hate. It was about misunderstanding. Aerosmith thought Van Halen was gunning for them, when in reality, Van Halen was just being Van Halen. Over time, those misunderstandings would fade as both bands found common ground. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually, Aerosmith began to see Van Halen differently. The more shows they played together, the more obvious it became that Van Halen wasn't trying to steal their identity. They were carving out their own. Eddie's guitar brilliance, Alex's powerhouse drumming, Michael Anthony's harmonies, and Roth's wild presence added up to something unique. One night after a particularly powerful set, members of Aerosmith admitted to themselves that Van Halen had it. They were no longer just an opening act trying too hard. They were the real deal. Aerosmith began watching from the side of the stage instead of avoiding them. They noticed the precision behind the madness, the way Eddie could make a guitar sing and scream at the same time. The turning point was respect. Aerosmith realized that Van Halen wasn't their replacement or their enemy. They were the next wave of rock and roll. And instead of being threatened, Aerosmith started to admire it. The annoyance turned into acceptance. And from there, a strange kind of brotherhood began to grow. Once Aerosmith let go of the irritation, they began to learn from Van Halen. Steven Tyler picked up on David Lee Roth's athletic stage antics, while Roth admitted to borrowing some of Tyler's flamboyant style. Joe Perry respected Eddie's new guitar techniques and even began experimenting with different sounds, inspired by what Eddie could do. For Van Halen, touring with Aerosmith was like a masterclass in survival. They saw the dark side of rock fame up close, the drugs, the chaos, the burnout, and it shaped how they approached their own careers. While Van Halen would later face their own internal struggles, they understood early on what could happen if a band lost control. Instead of clashing, the two groups began feeding off each other's energy. Aerosmith's grit and swagger balanced Van Halen's polished speed. Together, they were showing the world that rock had many faces and that each band could shine in its own way. The rivalry was becoming less about annoyance and more about mutual influence. What Aerosmith eventually realized was that fans didn't want to choose between the two. The audiences were big enough for both. Aerosmith had built their reputation on sleazy, bluesy hard rock anthems like Sweet Emotion and Walk This Way. Van Halen, on the other hand, was ushering in a new sound with Runnin' with the Devil and Eruption. Fans loved the raw, dangerous vibe of Aerosmith and also adored the playful, explosive energy of Van Halen. They weren't rivals in the fans' eyes. They were a double dose of rock greatness. Some concert goers came for Aerosmith and left as Van Halen fans, and vice versa. This realization helped Aerosmith soften their attitude. The crowd wasn't abandoning them. They were expanding their love of rock. Aerosmith remained legends, and Van Halen became the new heroes of the next generation. Together, they represented the bridge between classic 70s rock and the rising sound of the late 70s and early 80s. As years went on, the respect between Aerosmith and Van Halen grew stronger. Steven Tyler openly praised Eddie Van Halen's genius, calling him one of the most innovative guitarists of all time. Joe Perry admitted that while Eddie's style was different, it was undeniable and brilliant Van Halen, for their part, never stopped giving Aerosmith credit. David Lee Roth once said that Aerosmith was one of the blueprints for how Van Halen approached live shows. Larger than life, unpredictable, and always loud. The younger band never wanted to replace Aerosmith. They wanted to follow their path while making their own mark. By the 1980s, both bands had carved out their own legacies. Aerosmith survived near collapse from drugs and came back stronger. Van Halen soared to superstardom with records like 1984. The early annoyance was long gone, replaced by mutual admiration that both bands carried for the rest of their careers. Looking back, the story of Aerosmith and Van Halen isn't really about rivalry. It's about growth. Aerosmith felt annoyed at first, not because Van Halen lacked talent, but because they had too much of it. Watching a younger band light up the stage stirred up old insecurities, but instead of letting bitterness win, Aerosmith grew to respect what Van Halen represented. In many ways, Van Halen reminded Aerosmith of themselves when they were hungry and unstoppable. And for Van Halen, Aerosmith represented the dream of longevity, proving that a band could survive chaos and still come out swinging. Today, when fans talk about both bands, it's never about who was better. It's about how both shaped rock and roll in their own ways. Aerosmith brought danger and grit. Van Halen brought innovation and speed. Together, they pushed rock forward, even if it started with a little annoyance backstage.